The price of uranium has skyrocketed from above $30 a pound to more than $51 at its high last year, all in the span of a few months in 2021. We've come back down a little bit. We're trading at around $43 a pound today. So what is the outlook for 2022? We're here to discuss this with our next guest, Mart Wolbert. He is the author of the Contrarian Codex Report, a newsletter focusing on the uranium markets, and he's been doing his own research since 2020. Mart, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. Last time was great, so I'm glad to be back.
Last time was great. You're an entrepreneur. You've started your own newsletter, so you're running this business now. You've grown very popular on social media. Under the hashtag Yellow Bull. Is it Yellow Bull on Twitter?
Yeah.
So
Yellow
how many followers?
Yellow
Bull 11. How many followers do you have now, Mart?
I think almost 13,000. It's kind of mind-boggling. I started the Twitter account in August of last year, and it's crazy. The support has been amazing.
Well, congratulations and best of luck for 2022. Speaking of 2022, we're going to recap, first of all, what happened last year and provide the audience with your outlook on what's going to happen to uranium in the new year. So let's talk about the price action. Huge run up in September. Let's talk about the demand and supply fundamentals behind that run up.
Got it. Uranium, the whole bullish story for uranium is basically just a simple arithmetic supply and demand story. You have around 180 million pounds of uranium in demand on the demand side each year. And then you have last year 120 million pounds for supply. So right out of the gate, you see like a big difference between what you have for demand and what you have for supply. The problem with this is that normally a market will write itself out at the right price points. But in the case of uranium, what we're seeing right now is that we're still below price levels that will incentivize enough new production to come online. That wouldn't really matter if demand was falling, but it's not. Demand is rising more and more, and we've seen that this year, and we're going to discuss that further in this interview as well. Mm-hmm. But supply also cannot respond at these prices. And with this muted supply response and potentially higher costs for uranium miners as well, given the inflationary environment and also supply bottlenecks, it's the story is only getting better for uranium, and that is reflected into the price action. We saw the uranium market finally coming out of its nearly decade-long bear market that started after Fukushima, and in December of last year, we finally saw that snap that put this uranium bull market back into action. And what we saw is that since December of last year, the Uranium ETF, that's a pure play uranium ETF that people can invest in, it went up 250% from the start of the bull run to the peak of just a month ago. So that's a great thing to see. And of course, we saw plenty of correction because that's what happens in such a small volatile market. We're in the middle of like a 30 to 50% correction. This is something that you see time and again. It's something that we saw in the last bull market, and it's something that we will likely keep seeing. So it's important to really be aware of the fundamentals that I just described, is to make sure that you have that conviction, because we're nowhere near the end of this bull market, but we're also nowhere near the end of any other corrections that we may see in the years ahead.
So, Mart, we talked about this briefly last time, you and I. The spot physical uranium trust, ticker U.UN, on the Toronto Exchange. What impact did that trust have on the price of uranium? It came online this year, the trust.
They had an absolutely massive impact. What they did, they came into this market, and since the start of the ATM, since it went online, they secured 23 million pounds of uranium. That's an absolutely huge amount. And this is not something that is, because some people were afraid that this might create an overhang, but Sprott has been very clear in his messaging. I've been speaking to John Chiampaglia, the CEO of Sprott Asset Management as well, and he was very clear in saying that this is secured into a warehouse and this is not going to come out in a few years. The Sprott Physical Uranium Trust has very clear intentions, and that is stacking physical uranium. And that 23 million pounds is enough to theoretically fuel the entire nuclear fleet of France alone. And if you combine that with what the Physical Uranium Trust was already holding before Sprott took over, there was approximately 41 million pounds now in total. That's a third of global uranium supply. They have had an absolutely massive impact, and they are nowhere near done, because as you mentioned, next year will be some very great things to look forward to, which will include Sprott as well as one of the key drivers of this market. The first one we can look forward to in Q1 is their takeover of the rights for the URNM ETF that we just discussed. And that will not only help create more attention for it because the Sprott brand name will be associated with that ETF, but it will also just help get more positive attention. And what we will see later in the year, hopefully, is that the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust is pursuing a New York Stock Exchange listing. And if they're able to receive this, that will probably be a Q3 or a Q4 story for next year. If they're able to get this, they will open the doors for a lot more capital to come in, and they will also, that additional liquidity will help make it even more attractive for large amounts of capital to come in. And you have a circular-like effect where capital comes in, they buy more pounds, the price goes up, it becomes more attractive, more liquid, and more capital can come in. So that's definitely something to look forward to.
I think people who haven't followed the uranium markets might be surprised at why this year's move is so significant, because if you take a look at the price over the last 10 years, you'll see that the price of uranium has been steadily declining over the last 10 years. It's bottomed out around 2017, 2018, and then it's slowly crept back up, but has been trading in a range for the last number of years. It wasn't until this past year, more specifically this past summer, that the price shot up almost parabolically upwards. So it wasn't even a gradual increase. So that's why last year was significant to examine. Now, people might be wondering, why is it then, Mart, that the price of uranium for the last 10 years has been downward trending, if not flat?
Well, after Fukushima, what still happened is that some demand was taken offline, particularly Japan is the biggest example. And what you had is a market in oversupply, and a market in oversupply will sort itself out by dropping the price and not having any new production being able to come online. But the problem is new production still did come online because it was incentivized by a high price before Fukushima happened. So you have a structural oversupply, and it took around a decade for the market to eat away at that oversupply. It took companies like Chemical and recently Kazatomprom who agreed to produce 20% below the subsoil use agreement up until 2022 and 2023, which was very significant. And it took the combined efforts of them, as well as some other factors, to finally make uranium bottom out. And now we're on an upward trajectory again. What helped last year is that COVID, because of the COVID issues, Cigar Lake, one of the biggest uranium mines in the world, shut down. There were more supply disruptions to be seen as well. So this combined as well, in combination with more financial interest in the uranium market, this combined for a big move in the equities. And now we're on the cusp of what I think will be another big move into 2022.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll talk about your outlook in just a minute. Before we get into that, let's talk about supply in a little more detail. Where does uranium come from predominantly? What are the countries or jurisdictions in the world that have the most uranium mining?
Well, the largest amount of uranium comes from Kazatomprom, or it comes from Kazakhstan, but Kazatomprom is the largest producer in the world with around 23% stake in the global uranium market, which is absolutely humongous. And the other uranium that you see come out of the ground, you see in places in Africa like Namibia or Niger. You see a lot of uranium being located in Canada, which also where the aforementioned Cigar Lake and another big mine, McArthur River, are located. You see some uranium production in the US, but that has fallen off of an absolute cliff in the last few years. And I think a higher price will incentivize new production. Mm-hmm. You see some uranium coming out of different countries as well, such as Australia, Uzbekistan. And yeah, that is where the uranium comes from. And the one thing that people should also realize is that the uranium doesn't really come out of the ground just to be put into a reactor immediately. It goes through a long fuel cycle of around 1.5 to 2 years. You have to go through enrichment. It has to go through different processes to make sure that you have this nuclear fuel rod ready to produce energy in the power plant. And that makes a supply response significantly delayed. So even at higher uranium prices, we will still not see an immediate supply response, as you might more reasonably in a shorter time frame see with things like natural gas or oil.
Yes, right. So now you mentioned that the price right now needs to be higher before some of the miners in North America, at least, are incentivized to resume production. What is that price?
Well, the mostly accepted equilibrium price level before we saw all these supply disruptions, inflationary environment, was around $65. But what you're looking at right now with those issues is that something around close to 70, maybe $80 a pound will be needed to get enough supply response come online to meet that ever-growing demand that we discussed. But I don't think it will stop there, because as we discussed last time, these cyclical businesses, they don't stop at equilibrium pricing after being in a decade-long bear market. They often shoot through to mark a newer high. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a higher high than the previous one, but it will more than likely be far above equilibrium price levels.
Yes.
And my outlook for 2022 in terms of price levels, for spot price at least, I think we'll be around that new equilibrium price level on $70, $80. But I think we can, and I think we perhaps will go higher than that as well. Will it be 2022? I don't know, but we will likely see that within the next 1 or 2 years.
So your outlook for 2022 is $70 to $80 a pound.
Yes,
okay.
So almost double from here.
Kazakhstan, Nigeria, some other African nations that are mining uranium that you mentioned, can they produce uranium at under the equilibrium price that you mentioned, so under $60 a pound, basically today's prices or even last year's prices? Are they able to produce a much cheaper or lower costs than their North American competitors?
Well, talking about the proverbial elephant in the room, yes, Kazatomprom can produce far below those price levels. And that is one thing that has scared the market, because at higher price levels, the market has been scared that Kazatomprom may come to the market and really flood the market with those cheap pounds because they can produce so cheaply. But as we discussed, they have chosen to go for quality over quantity. And that is something that they've been doing for years now, and that they plan to continue for the next 1 or 2 years. So even though there is lower cost supply out there, that likely will not even nearly be enough to balance the supply-demand deficit that we see right now.
Okay, so current events that you're looking out for that could drive the price up to your range of $70 to $80 a pound.
Well, there are 5 points. First of all, I think that a big part of it is the geopolitical support for nuclear power. And besides that geopolitical support that may come into the form of life extensions of new builds we mostly see in Asia, with China coming out with the news that they're planning to build 150 new reactors by 2035, which is an absolutely insane amount. And that will, if they make it that far, they will consume that alone, the 150 reactors, they will consume the entire annual consumption of Kazatomprom, and that is not to be underestimated. But also to go together with that public or that geopolitical support is the public sentiment part of it, because what I've seen on social media, but also in personal conversations, that people are growing more and more fond of nuclear power as that climate change solution. So, and that will also, going to the second point, make sure that more capital is allocated into uranium. If nuclear power gets that ESG label, it will open a door for more and more capital to come in and more investors to be interested into uranium as well. I think that on to point 3, which will also help with that capital coming into the sector, is that energy is very, very undervalued on a historical level compared to the world equities market. I think that once we see capital flowing out of overvalued tech and going into real value into the energy sector, that is when you will see a big response. And 4 is basically what we discussed with Sprott, with the URNM takeover of the rights, as well as a potential New York Stock Exchange listing and more stacking of pounds. And the last one, which is perhaps the most important one of all, is that the term market, which drives between 70 and 75% of all movement into the uranium market, is heating up right now. We're seeing utilities increase their amount of off market conversations. We see contracts already being signed. We just saw 2 contracts being signed out of China. And we're seeing Western utilities also coming in, being interested in signing new long-term contracts going out into 2028, 2029, 2030, sometimes even beyond. And those price levels in those contracts, they're not at the 20 level anymore. They're not at the 30 level anymore. Some of them are at a 40 level, but most of them will very quickly move to 50 and beyond. And what we see right now is just a game where they want to make sure that their reactor can stay online. And if they get and those reactors that were poised to perhaps come offline and those that get life extensions, they will need to get that security of supply to stay in operation. And I also always like to quote Kazatomprom here, who very rightly in one of the recent presentations stated that there may not be enough guaranteed supply for everybody. And I think that will be exactly the reason why we will see an overshoot in the uranium price.
Yeah. What do you think about it, before I let you go, what do you think about nuclear reactors as a technology? They're pretty old these days. If you take a look at how, the history of nuclear power, I read that 1/3 of nuclear reactors in the US, for example, are boiling water reactors. And I had a friend tell me this the other day. We had a discussion about nuclear reactors, and he said, this is a very inefficient technology, his opinion. He said, all you're doing is you're using nuclear power to burn fuel and boil water. You're using the steam from the boiled water to move turbines. It's pretty inefficient when you think about it. Don't you think someone will come up with something better in the future and not use nuclear power anymore? Is that possible?
I definitely think somebody someday will come up with something better to produce energy. I think that is the nature of us human beings, to always try to keep improving and keep making things as good for ourselves as possible. And having a new, very efficient power source would be a natural transition for us. But that is years and years, perhaps even decades away. So I don't think that invalidates any of the things that we talked about today when it comes to uranium. But going with nuclear power in particular, yes, we see a lot of old reactors in the world, and those perhaps will need to be replaced in the decades ahead. But this technology is our best way to fight climate change, because this technology allows us to have a base load power source at approximately 93% capacity factor, and it has 0 emissions. And people talk about the waste all day long. Oh, the waste is such a problem, but the waste is captured almost in its entirety, and it's stored on site in concrete casks. And there has never been a reported incident or human casualties directly attributed to nuclear waste. And that's not something you can say for coal or oil or gas burning. So yeah, no, this is the best technology that we have to fight climate change. And it's ever evolving, because everything you see right now with nuclear power is always seemingly associated with the next step. And the next step is small modular reactors. We see a lot of support for that from governments around the world. And that is something we can look forward to later in this decade, which is basically a more efficient version of nuclear power in a smaller package.
I'm looking, well, these are fission reactors. So just to clarify, I'm looking forward to nuclear fusion reactors that are, less hot than the sun, but that's a conversation for another time. Mart, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show this year. Thank you for your help with Kitco, and thank you for your insights into 2022. I look forward to speaking with you next year.
Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure, and I wish everybody a very healthy and happy new year.
Where can people follow your work and read more about your research?
They can follow me on Yellowbull11 at Twitter, and I put most of my research and interviews on my own platform, which is patreon.com/Contrarian Codex. It's where I do write-ups, where I write a bi-weekly newsletter. It's where I interview company CEOs, private investors, and also do a bunch more company analysis. And it's become my full-time job now. I'm enjoying every single moment of it, and building a great community.
Great. Well, congratulations again, and best of luck for the next year. And thank you for watching Kitco News. Mart, you are my final interview for 2021. Thank you again to all the Kitco viewers who have been active listeners and participants of our show over the last year. Thank you for watching and tuning in. We have more for you for 2022. Stay tuned.